We are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. Guests get to share their journey of challenges and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome these. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathon Taylor. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally. And Jonathon, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
You were telling me as we got started, it was a little steamy and warm where you are.
Yeah. I'm in Austin, Texas. Even though I don't sound like it. Fortunately, I killed that accent a long time ago. I want to say it's in the hundreds today, and it's just going to get hotter. This summer is going to be brutal.
Well, we have an exciting lineup of topics to dive into, so hopefully our conversation stays on a little bit of the cooler side, but I'm sure it'll be interesting. Let's dive into things with learning a little bit about yourself, how you became a leader in the accessibility space.
Sure. I say leader. Leader is maybe a little bit grandiose for me, but certainly had my hands in a few projects here and there. I've been in the accessibility space, as I'm sure many of your guests have been, more or less my whole life. I'm a visually impaired person myself, so lived experience dealing with accessibility on a day-to-day basis, of course, and then that translated well into moving into the tech industry. So I've worked in a few different places. Specifically, I've done my time with Google, I did my time with Apple, and I've also spent some time working in the Braille note taker part of the industry, which is an interesting little side project. And most recently, I'm with CVS and working on the accessibility engineering side of things, specifically as an accessibility trainer. My job is to work with engineers, with designers, and make sure that they are adhering to good accessibility standards, as well as doing a variety of other tasks. It's kind of a wide role at this point, and it gives me the opportunity to really get involved in a lot of different really interesting projects, especially as things change, which they are as they are now so rapidly, right? It's a very aggressively growing field. So there's a lot of good opportunities happening right now. And my job gives me the opportunity to be involved in a lot of them. So it's pretty exciting. It's an exciting time.
For sure. I can appreciate kind of the recognition of living in an accessibility space your whole life. And so coming into prestigious companies like Apple and now CVS, I have the opportunity to meet several other folks from the CVS organization where it's clear the priority is on accessibility. When you were sharing that you do training, you have to help manage the standards and a variety of things, the first question and thought was like, how the heck do you go about prioritizing the myriad of things that fall into accessibility?
It's tough, right? It's tough to consistently make the right calls about what needs to be prioritized and when. Obviously, our baseline is WCAG conformance. So if we can hit that baseline, great. And that in itself is always a bit of a struggle to make sure that people are being compliant, making sure that we've developed curriculums that get them where they need to go. We have had quite a bit of good success with that recently. We've recently revamped our test cases. So our engineering department is well equipped to handle the WCAG conformance. But that is really just the baseline. It's the floor, right? And there are a lot of things that go far above and beyond that, which that's where the prioritization becomes difficult. Figuring out, should we be focusing on inclusive design? Should we be focusing on AI? Should we be focusing on design strategies, on shift left, on any number of things, right? And that's where the questions come from, and where it's helpful if we have clear goals and clear leadership plans that say, all right, we need to, if we approach this aggressively and, for example, manage to achieve an aggressive shift left, then maybe that solves for some of the issues around design strategy. for example, right? Or if we shift left, then maybe we've integrated accessibility throughout the software development lifecycle rather than having the end remediation, which has been the case in a lot of companies that I've worked for. So right now, I would say the priorities, at least my priorities, and as I say, I'm just in training, so there's a lot of different facets to our accessibility work. But from a training perspective, my focus is on empowering those people who don't have a lot of exposure to accessibility from the start and making sure that they not only understand the impact of accessibility, but also the mechanisms they can use to skill themselves up and level set across the organization. So this includes things like working with content authors who often get left out of the equation, making sure that they are using things like the accessibility checker built into Microsoft Office products, and just really often very simple things. But if we can make those sort of impact statements happen, then I find a lot of it is a trickle up effect from the ground up, right? We start seeing substantive change. We start seeing things like champions emerge. We start seeing things like people start taking on their own accessibility campaigns and projects in different parts of the org. And that's really, I think, the best and strongest way to go about this is find these priorities, make sure that the priorities are being socialized and shared to these different stakeholders, and then watch as it grows. And if you do it right, you don't have to be the ones who have your hands in everything. The people who you are training then pick it up and roll with it. So that's what we're trying to do with some successes, some setbacks, and it's always interesting though.
The idea of, and I guess one thing just to clarify for everyone who's listening, the shift left, what does that mean?
So that means shift the effort of accessibility to the people who are producing the products, rather than having all of the accessibility knowledge live within a few specific domain experts. So instead of having just an accessibility engineering core who can step in and do accessibility remediation and recommendations, the idea is every engineer should know how to do accessibility, and it should be part of their standard workflow. And if we can achieve that, then we don't have to have nearly as much remediation, which is both good for us. It takes more stuff off of our plate, and also it's just good for the projects and for the organization. It saves money, right? So whether or not it's a codified shift left campaign or not, that's kind of the general vibe, I guess is the word I would use, that we're aiming for, or at least that I'm aiming for at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of incorporating accessibility into the creative process, whether you're creative from a development or design, content, what have you, that ability to incorporate it. So I think that's brilliant. And, having got to know a few of the folks early on at CVS, we took a lot of inspiration with some of the open source solutions that CVS provides, which is tremendous. How you had mentioned, the advocacy, starting with the simple impacts that the team members can realize. How do you measure the impact of the training?
So that's a loaded question. That is the real crux of it, is metric analysis, right? We can produce trainings all day long. Efficacy is the question, and not just efficacy, but also retention. So we've gone through several different models, and what I'm finding interesting is really going into different types of learning approaches right now and trying to see which sticks and which lands. So, for example, we often have end-to-end trainings. So a training that you start, it is procedural. You go through the training. It teaches you one thing and then builds upon that thing and then builds upon that and builds upon that, right? And by the end of the training, theoretically, you walk away with the knowledge that you needed. Maybe there's an assessment at the end, you pass it, you've got the credit, and you're good. That is one model, and we've certainly used that model. Another model, though, that I'm interested in, and I've been trying to experiment with it a little bit, is more of a self-guided approach, where you provide a set of resources, sort of like a knowledge base, and you anticipate that people will self-serve themselves and find the things that they need to understand. Rather than having to go through a whole learning journey, you make it easier for them to find those bite-sized pieces. And then hopefully that information is easily accessible and easily located. If that's done right, then it's less of a training and more of a knowledge journey that they can consistently come back to. So a content author, for example, who's doing PDF remediation may not necessarily need to learn the entirety of PDF remediation today, but they do need to go figure out how to deal with some empty tags that are in their document. And they can go find that quickly and easily and solve for it. And if they solve for it once, maybe they'll solve for it again later. So that's another model that we're attempting. And then, of course, we have a lot of collaborative and instructor-led trainings where we try to collaborate with different stakeholders across the organization and engage with them to find what people need and meet them where they're at. And that's really another sort of way of gathering your metrics, right? It's sort of a start at the beginning rather than gather metrics at the end. Ask what people need and then tailor the experience to them. Does that necessarily mean that we can judge retention afterwards? Not always. But if it is something that is targeted to their needs, then the expectation, the hope is that they will want to retain it because they've asked for it, rather than telling them, this is what we think you should know. Certainly, we need to do that to an extent, especially when we're talking about WCAG conformance. If we can solve for the issues that they are presently experiencing and do that proactively and be a resource for them, then maybe they will not only retain it, but also then become evangelists themselves and socialize that information. So that's a long, long way of saying metrics are hard. It's very hard to judge whether or not someone has properly retained information, especially in a very large organization. The best we can really do at this point is, I think, try to meet people where they're at, solve for issues, and then see if those issues become less durable issues, see if maybe they start to fade over time. And that's something that we're actively trying to determine.
What is the feedback that you're getting on the needs requests?
So far, it's great. Without going into too many details, it's been pretty good. We've got a lot of outreach from different parts of the organization who have said, "Hey, we need this, or we need this. We need training on communications, or we need training on." I said PDF remediation because it's at the top of my head. We get a lot of requests on PDF remediation. We also get a lot of requests for PowerPoint, for example, and then of course we have endless requests on engineering side of things. So the feedback has been pretty good as long as we can respond quickly and rapidly, and solve it within the time frame that the person actually needs it solved. That's always the challenge, right? Because it's
Supply and
a big
demand.
organization. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And in addition to this kind of sort of intentional instructional design, which I'm doing at CVS, I also do some consulting on the side, normally geared towards secondary education instructors and students. And I find I'm trying to model some of the CVS experiences that I'm doing off of those experiences. I find a lot of the time, if you go into an interaction, say with a teacher, a secondary education teacher, and say, all right, I think you need to know all of this stuff, a lot of the time it bounces right off of them. But if you come to them and say, what is your student struggling with, and solve that, then you not only get retention, they also keep coming back because they'll keep having questions. So my experience shows that the feedback mechanism and the feedback loop is really strong and pretty much always effective. It's harder to judge at the big organizational scale, but I think it will hold true.
So you have a wide breadth of exposure across the organization, right?
Wide-ish. We're trying.
Well, hearing that you're touching upon multiple disciplines within a large organization like CVS is impressive. What are some of the challenges? I mean, you talked about prioritization in the beginning, but I'm curious some of the macro challenges you see trying to scale and manage this strategy.
Well, I would say this is not a unique answer. I'm sure everyone has the same answer, but one of the very first issues that you're always going to run into is engagement, right? People don't understand the need, and therefore they don't know what questions to ask. So I say the feedback model is great, but one of the major problems that you have, especially when you start scaling, is you ask a large audience, all right, what do you need? And what should we be focusing on? And a lot of the times they don't know. They don't have enough information to formulate the questions. And that's where it's good sometimes to switch to a different model where we say, okay, we clearly need to level set so that you do know the right questions and so that you are starting to understand the barriers that you're facing. So that is problem number one. Problem number two is scaling a training in such a way that it is both useful and also something that can be returned to rather than a one-off training means that it has a lot of maintenance involved.
Mm.
If you try to scale a training, for example, one of the trainings that we're in the process of looking into is alt text, with some touches on Gen AI and alt text, which is obviously a hot topic right now, but also just generally speaking, how do you solve alt text? How do you do it creatively and with proper intent? How do you address author intent? How do you reconcile the differences between the alt text guidance that's out there or the WCAG alt text guidance with what graphic designers and instructional designers have been taught their entire lives? How do you handle these differences? And when you start scaling these questions and start pushing it to these really large audiences who have very little exposure to accessibility, you almost get overwhelmed. It's very difficult to maintain and keep up with the sheer volume of questions that are going to come in because people don't understand it, and it's challenging to find an answer for a complex topic like alt text that will be true in all cases, especially when it's something that is context specific. So it's still a journey. I'm still in the process of trying to, even for myself, come up with some definitive answers, right? Like, when is it right to use decorative for an image? And is it ever right? Or is it even possible to say that there are times where it should be decorative? Or is it entirely context-based? So a lot of the ambiguity that is inherent to accessibility does present challenges when you're trying to scale simple solutions out to a large audience.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of am thinking about the whiteboarding that is probably needed to figure this out.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I go back and forth all the time on these questions, and that's part of the thing is even people who are well versed in accessibility, even people who have lived experience with accessibility, we don't really agree on some of these things. So it's very difficult to train on something that is a moving target.
What's the disagreement? I mean, you touched on some of the contextual.
Yeah, like for example, just like I mean, there's so many instances, right? But for example, decorative alt text. Personally, I believe that pretty much every visual element should have alt text. I don't really believe in the concept of a decorative image because I think any image that is used for a reason. Even if that reason is purely aesthetic, it's still a reason. It sets a tone, it sets a theme. Maybe it is intended to be an attention grabber. Maybe it's a means of breaking up the flow so that way there's not as much cognitive fatigue. There's 100 reasons why an image might be used. And I would argue that all of those are valid reasons, and all of those are reasons that are equally true whether or not you're perceiving that image visually or not. I would say decorative images, not a thing. On the other hand, WCAG absolutely does not say that, and a lot of people do believe in decorative images. There are a lot of people with lived experience who say, I don't want to see, I don't want to hear that there's a line or a rectangle here or an image of a basketball for no reason, right? Like, they just don't want that information. So what's the answer? If a content author comes to me and says, should I mark this as decorative? What do I tell them? Do I tell them my belief? Do I tell them WCAG's conformance? What's the answer, right? So until the accessibility community is able to come up with a robust solution that solves for that level of ambiguity, it's difficult to train on. And I do think there are ways to solve for that ambiguity, but we don't have it yet.
Mm. Well, I would say, besides your professional exposure, the fact that you started this conversation, and I would imagine as part of how people know you throughout the CVS org, right? The fact that you're coming from firsthand experience probably gives you some pretty quick, immediate credibility.
It does, but I think the the arguments against my viewpoint are valid, right? So even though I personally would want all images described to me, that doesn't mean that that is the right call,
Mm,
right? Because it's totally fair for somebody to say that they don't want all that information. Information overload is a real thing. I think this is something that needs to be solved at a technical level rather than at a theory or philosophical level. I just don't think we're quite there yet technically. But I think, at least until we are there, the best strategy is to communicate that level of ambiguity to the training audience, to say, we can't tell you if decorative is good or bad, or if this image should be decorative. We can tell you that intent is what matters and context is what matters. And we can try to train on the understanding of context and the understanding of intent. So that way the author is empowered to make those choices themselves and determine, is this something that I think should be decorative? And there's always going to be subjectivity built into it. But I think until we have a technical solution that allows, for example, a screen reader user to opt in or out of alt text, or have maybe Gen AI running in parity with a screen reader that is informed on the user's preferences and able to dynamically generate alt text to suit their preferences. Until we have something like that, which I don't think exists yet, not that I've seen.
yeah.
I think the answer is to try and train on ambiguity, so to speak.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head with the training on intent and the. I mean, I'm thinking back to like when DXPs launched, right? And it was dynamic content generation based upon user persona and training on intent, right?
Yeah.
I
Yep.
I don't think we're that far off. I was meeting with one of the larger cell phone and mobile providers, and at the operating level, they brought that up exactly. That like the testing and the solutioning, the focus for them is all around how do you dynamically preference and intent based actually turn on and off certain functionality about how the screen reader reads the page, right? Because I may scroll and slow down and get tripped up by certain decorative images or other maybe line breaks in the page, and you don't. Well, if I build an adaptive universal design, your preferences and my preferences can universally be met. Right now, I don't. Yeah, I haven't seen that connection between preferences and intent.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's where the industry needs to move. And I think it will, but I think we're still not quite there. Right now, the focus is still on solving at the authorship level rather than solving at the user level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This probably isn't the first time this conversation's come up, but it's like that shift from author to user is it creates so much more scale, right? Because designing for every use case is never going to be accommodated.
Right. Or
And
possible.
yeah, right. And the functionality of the iPhone and Android constantly changing. And so it's not cheap to go back and redesign software, right? So there's sort of this cat and mouse game of like, well, who's going to stay ahead? And it seems so logical. And I know there's privacy and probably HIPAA components behind choosing accessibility preferences and exposing that. But I think that would definitely ruffle up the current methodology.
Yeah, and I think you can dodge a lot of those, like, for example, HIPAA concerns if it's an opt-in solution built into existing AT, or even built into your browser conditions, right? Like,
Right.
it's definitely something that can be done. I think it's within the realm of technically possible at this stage. I don't see any reason why it can't be done. It's just someone needs to take the project on, right? And it costs money.
You and I may have a side project right after this episode.
Let's do it. I'll tell you what, it would make my life a lot
you're
easier.
Nail on the head of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people using CVS physical and digital properties. And I mean, the expectation's so high, but like, how scalable is it? And having those types of breakthroughs, it's game changing.
Yeah, and I think it's something that extends the power of this kind of innovation when it does happen. And I do think it's a win, not an if. Will be massive. I think it goes far beyond any subset of digital apps. I think it goes to pretty much everything, right? It goes to applications that are otherwise inherently inaccessible. I think if it's built well enough and robustly enough and has sufficient capabilities built in, maybe we start getting things like accessible graphic design or accessible video editing or accessible, any of these things that are otherwise borderline impossible no matter how many accessible solutions you throw at them. So you start really getting into the realm of, like you said, a universal solution for all accessible tech needs. Is that a short-term thing? I don't think so, but I think we'll see it at some point.
What are the short-term disruptions coming to accessibility?
So, I think everyone has probably said AI to that question.
I don't let that off easy anymore. That's like a loaded question you gave me, or a loaded answer.
Yeah, what I think it is, what I think is coming soon, is you're going to start seeing much closer integration with accessibly designed. So I'm thinking about things like Copilot, right? Where devs are now and engineers are getting the capacity to front load a lot of the effort that they put into their work into something like Copilot. It'll generate a lot of the code for them, and naturally they're going to have to go back and they're going to have to cherry pick and they're going to have to solve and they're going to have to troubleshoot. But we're going to start seeing some very rapid deployment of code that is generated through AI. If we can get in early, and there are a lot of efforts going towards this, if we can get in early and start making sure that the prompts and the inputs for these AIs have accessibility inherently built in, then it takes away a lot of the need for training. I hate to say it, I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot here, but if AI is producing material and the AI already has the accessibility standards front loaded into it, then you've solved for a lot of the problems where the engineer doesn't have the experience or the information to make it accessible. It doesn't matter. It's been done already. Now, of course, that is something that's going to take a very long time to do right. And you run into the same ambiguity question that I was bringing up earlier, even within a purely technical area. Not everyone agrees on best accessibility practices. Not even everyone agrees on WCAG. There are multiple interpretations of WCAG. So that has to be reconciled and it has to be addressed and it has to be handled correctly with the AI. But if it is done right, then suddenly all apps on the App Store might be accessible. Or, new websites may be accessible. Yeah. I mean, certainly that's that goes from short term to long term. But I think in the short term, we will start seeing, if we can do this right, a lot of improvements, very, very rapid improvements, and a lot more access granted.
I couldn't agree more. I have a final thing to leave you with before our episode closes out, which is you had mentioned, I don't know if misalignment was the right word, but between the WCAG standard and the training that you receive as a UI or UX student. Why is there such like this misalignment? And if I misheard, then please.
Oh no, I think you're right. So I think what I was referring to was, for example, a content designer or someone who has gone through graphic design training, or they have experience with marketing, or any number of things that have an extremely robust, long-lived paradigm of visually oriented design schematics. WCAG is often not just impenetrable to them, but also sort of counterproductive. And so I think misalignment is a good word for it. I think what happens a lot of the time is in the accessibility arena, we assume that everyone understands and frankly cares about accessibility. And so we say, here's WCAG, here's our standards, you have to follow it. And I think while that may be true, it's also kind of short-sighted of us, because a lot of graphic designers or people who have experience with creating images and with making sure that their website looks pretty and all these things, right? Which are very meaningful and have impacts upon the market. They see WCAG and they go, I can't do 90% of the stuff that I've been trained to do. And so they're not going to do it. Why would they do it, right? Their job doesn't say to do it. Their training doesn't say to do it. Their background doesn't say to do it. The only person telling them to do it is Jonathon Taylor over in accessibility. And, who cares about that, right? So we need to meet them where they're at instead and communicate that accessibility doesn't have to mean that you discard all of the things that you've learned and disregard your skill set. It just means that you need to evolve it and tailor it in such a way that it can be responsive to the needs of everyone. And that's a message that I think we miss a lot within the accessibility community. And it's one of the major frustration points that I see with our content authors and even with our designers and our devs is we're asking them to do something that is essentially counter to their job. They've been told to do a thing. We're telling them that they can't do that thing. And that's not a nice position to be in for anyone. And it's not a nice position for us to try and do as enforcers either. And I don't want to be an enforcer. So I would much, much rather, instead of using WCAG and other forms of conformance standards as a club, I would much rather meet them where they're at and adapt the pieces that work for them and find ways to solve for the pieces that don't. And it's not necessarily the most popular opinion. People really want WCAG to be the only thing that is ever done, and or other standards, right? And I just don't think that works.
Well, you left with a very impactful piece, which is finding the happy medium, and the win-win is what builds great products that are accessible, that deliver great experiences. So a wealth of takeaway today from you, Jonathon. I can't thank you enough for your time and the contributions to help grow the awareness and the education, all the great things that you're doing to champion accessibility throughout the organization, and to everyone who's listening today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Be good.